Hi there. Thank you. I'm Natasha Tretheway. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to start with some poems from a new collection that I'm working on, and then read from my most recent collection, Native Guard, after that. This first poem is a sequence of 4 poems after a series of Costa paintings by Juan Rodriguez Suarez, circa 1715. The Costa paintings illustrated the various mixed unions in colonial Mexico and the children of those unions, whose names and taxonomies were recorded in the Book of Castas. Taxonomy. 1. De Español y de India produce mestizo. The canvas is a leaden sky behind them, heavy with words, gold letters inscribing an equation of blood. This plus this equals this, as if a contract with nature or a museum label, ethnographic, precise. See how the father's hand, beneath its crown of lace, curls around his daughter's head. She's nearly fair as he is, calidad, see it in the brooch at her collar, the lace framing her face. An infant, she is born over the servant's left shoulder, bound to him by a sling, the plain blue cloth knotted at his throat. If the father, his hand on her skull, divines, as the physiognomist does, the mysteries of her character, discursive, legible on her light flesh, in the soft curl of her hair, we cannot know it, so gentle the eye he turns toward her. The mother glancing sideways toward him, the scarf on her head, white as his face, his powdered wig, gestures with one hand a shape like the letter C. See, she seems to say, what we have made. The servant, still a child, cranes his neck, turns his face up toward all of them. He is dark as history, origin of the word native, the weight of blood, a pale mistress on his back, heavier every year. 2. De Español y Negra produce mulatto. Still, the centuries have not dulled the sullenness of the child's expression. If there is light inside him, it does not shine through the paint that holds his face in profile, his domed forehead, eyes nearly closed beneath a heavy brow. Though inside the boy's father stands in his cloak and hat, it's as if he's just come in, or that he's leaving. We see him transient, rolling a cigarette, myopic, his eyelids drawn against the child passing before him. At the stove, the boy's mother contorts, watchful, her neck twisting on its spine, red beads yoked at her throat like a necklace of blood. Her face so black she nearly disappears into the canvas, the dark wall upon which we see the words that name them. What should we make of any of this? Remove the words above their heads, put something else in place of the child, a table perhaps upon which the man might set his hat, or a dog upon which to bestow the blessing of his touch. And the story changes. The boy is a palimpsest of paint, layers of color, history rendering him that precise shade of in-between. Before this, he was nothing, blank canvas, before image or word, before a last brushstroke fixed him in his place. 3. De Español y Mestizo produce castiza. How not to see in this gesture the mind of the colony? In the mother's arms, the child, hinged at her womb, dark cradle of mixed blood, call it Mexico, turns toward the father, reaching to him as if back to Spain. The promise of blood alchemy, 3 easy steps to purity. From a Spaniard and an Indian, a mestizo. From a mestizo and a Spaniard, a castizo. From a castizo and a Spaniard, a Spaniard. We see her here, 1 generation away, nearly slipping her mother's careful grip. 4, the Book of Castas. Call it the Catalogue of Mixed Bloods or the Book of Not Spaniard, not white, but mulatto returning backwards, or hold yourself in midair, and the Morisca, the Lobo, the Chino, Sambo albino, and the No te entiendo, the I don't understand you. Guidebook to the colony, record of each crossed birth, it is the typology of taint, of stain, blemish, sullying spot, that which can be purified, that which cannot, Canaan's black fate. How like a dirty joke it seems, what do you call that space between the dark geographies of sex? Call it the taint, as in taint one and taint the other. Illicit and yet naming still what is between. Between her parents, the child, mulatto, returning backwards, cannot slip their hold. The triptych their bodies make, in paint, in blood, her name, written down in the book of castas, all her kind, in thrall to a word. And now I'm going to start with some poems in an elegiac mood in honor of my mother, Gwendolyn Ann Turnbow. The Southern Crescent. In 1959, my mother is boarding a train. She is barely 16, her one large grip bulging with homemade dresses, whisper of crinoline and lace, her name stitched inside each one. She is leaving behind the dirt roads of Mississippi, the film of red dust around her ankles, the thin whistle of wind through the floorboards of the shotgun house, the very idea of home. Ahead of her, days of travel, one town after the next, and California, a word she can't stop repeating. Over and over, she will practice meeting her father, imagine how he must look, how different now from the one photo she has of him. She will look at it once more, pulling into the station at Los Angeles, and then again and again on the platform, no one like him in sight. The year the old Crescent makes its last run, my mother insists we ride it together. We leave Gulfport late morning heading east. Years before, we rode together to meet another man, my father, waiting for us as our train derailed. I don't recall how she must have held me, how her face sank as she realized again the uncertainty of it all, that trip, too, gone wrong. Today, she is sure we can leave home, bound only for whatever awaits us. The sun now setting behind us, the rails humming like anticipation, the train pulling us toward the end of another day. I watch each small town pass before my window until the light goes and the reflection of my mother's face appears, clearer now as evening comes on, dark and certain. This next poem has an epigraph from Robert Herrick that reads, "Fair daffodils we weep to see, you haste away so soon." Genus Narcissus. The road I walked home from school was dense with trees and shadow, creekside and lit by yellow daffodils, early blossoms bright against winter's last gray days. I must have known they grew wild, thought no harm in taking them, so I did, gathering up as many as I could hold, then presenting them in a jar to my mother. She put them on the sill, and I sat nearby, watching light bend through the glass, day easing into evening, proud of myself for giving my mother some small thing. Childish vanity. I must have seen in them some measure of myself, the slender stems, each blossom a head lifted up toward praise or bowed to meet its reflection. Walking home those years ago, I knew nothing of narcissus or the daffodil's short spring. How they dry like graveside flowers, rustling when the wind blew, a whisper treacherous from the sill. Be taken with yourself, they said to me. Die early to my mother. After your death. First, I emptied the closets of your clothes, threw out the bowl of fruit bruised from your touch, left empty the jars you bought for preserves. The next morning, birds rustled the fruit trees, and later, when I twisted a ripe fig loose from its stem, I found it half eaten, the other side already rotting, or, like another I plucked and split open, being taken from the inside, a swarm of insects hollowing it. I'm too late again, another space emptied by loss. Tomorrow, the bowl I have yet to fill. This next poem relies a little bit on the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Myth. I was asleep while you were dying. It's as if you slipped through some rift, a hollow I make between my slumber and my waking. The Erebus I keep you in, still trying not to let go. You'll be dead again tomorrow, but in dreams you live, so I try taking you back into morning. Sleep heavy, turning, my eyes open, I find you do not follow. Again and again, this constant forsaking. Again and again, this constant forsaking. My eyes open, I find you do not follow. You back into morning, sleep heavy, turning. But in dreams you live, so I try taking, not to let go. You'll be dead again tomorrow. The Erebus I keep you in, still trying, I make between my slumber and my waking. It's as if you slipped through some rift, a hollow. I was asleep while you were dying. Approaching the second anniversary, I guess, of Hurricane Katrina hitting straight on my hometown, Gulfport, Mississippi. This is a poem that I wrote a year before that that became quite literal after the storm hit. Theories of time and space. You can get there from here, though there's no going home. Everywhere you go will be somewhere you've never been. Try this. Head south on Mississippi 49, one by one, mile markers ticking off another minute of your life. Follow this to its natural conclusion. Dead end at the coast, the pier at Gulfport where riggings of shrimp boats are loose stitches in a sky threatening rain. Cross over the man-made beach, 26 miles of sand dumped on the mangrove swamp, buried terrain of the past. Bring only what you must carry, tome of memory, its random blank pages. On the dock where you board the boat for Ship Island, someone will take your picture. The photograph, who you were, will be waiting when you return. This is my fantasy of the canon of Southern poetry. Pastoral. In the dream, I am with the fugitive poets. We're gathered for a photograph. Behind us, the skyline of Atlanta, hidden by the photographer's backdrop, a lush pasture, green, full of soft-eyed cows, lowing, a chant that sounds like no, no, yes, I say, to the glass of bourbon I'm offered. We're lining up now, Robert Penwarren, his voice just audible above the drone of bulldozers, telling us where to stand. Say race, the photographer croons. I'm in blackface again when the flash freezes us. My father's white, I tell them, and rural. You don't hate the South, they ask. You don't hate it? About 10 years ago, the state of Alabama voted whether or not to remove the anti-miscegenation laws from the books. And whereas they did vote to get rid of them, these laws that, of course, couldn't be enforced, but were there for symbolic purposes, about 40-some% of the state wanted to keep them so that at least symbolically that they could say parents like mine shouldn't be married legally and people like me born legitimately in the state. This is, and I should say, it was because of sitting in this room several years ago and hearing Michael Collier read his Hustle Home that I was finally able to bring all of these things together in this poem. Miscegenation. In 1965, my parents broke 2 laws of Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, miss in Mississippi. A year later, they moved to Canada, followed a route the same as slaves, the train slicing the white glaze of winter, leaving Mississippi. Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus, given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage, his race unknown in Mississippi. My father was reading War and Peace when he gave me my name. I was born near Easter, 1966, in Mississippi. When I turned 33, my father said, "It's your Jesus year. You're the same age he was when he died." It was spring, the hills green in Mississippi. I know more than Joe Christmas did. Natasha is a Russian name, though I'm not. It means Christmas child, even in Mississippi. My mother dreams another country. Already the words are changing. She is changing from colored to Negro, black still years ahead. This is 1966. She is married to a white man, and there are more names for what grows inside her. It is enough to worry about words like mongrel and the infertility of mules and mulattoes while flipping through a book of baby names. She has come home to wait out the long months, her room unchanged since she's been gone, dolls winking down from every shelf, all of them white. Every day she is flanked by the rituals of superstition, and there is a name she will learn for this too, maternal impression, the shape like an unknown country marking the back of the newborn's thigh. For now, women tell her to clear her head, to steady her hands, or she'll gray a lock of the child's hair wherever she worries her own, imprint somewhere the outline of a thing she craves too much. They tell her to staunch her cravings by eating dirt. All spring she is sat on her hands, her fingers numb. For a while each day she can't feel anything she touches. The arbor out back, the landscape's green tangle, the molehill of her own swelling. Here, outside the city limits, cars speed by, clouds of red dust in their wake. She breathes it in, Mississippi, then drifts toward sleep, thinking of some place she's never been. Late, Mississippi is a dark backdrop bearing down on the windows of her room. On the TV in the corner, the station signs off, broadcasting its nightly salutation, the waving stars and stripes, our national anthem. Southern Gothic. I have lain down into 1970, into the bed my parents will share for only a few more years. Early evening, they have not yet turned from each other in sleep, their bodies curved, parentheses framing the separate lives they'll wake to. Dreaming, I am again the child with too many questions, the endless why and why and why. My mother cannot answer, her mouth closed, a gesture toward her future, cold lips stitched shut. The lines in my young father's face deepen toward an expression of grief. I have come home from the schoolyard with the words that shadow us in this small southern town. Peckerwood and nigger lover, half-breed and zebra, words that take shape outside us. We're huddled on the tiny island of bed, quiet in the language of blood, the house unsteady on its cinder block haunches, sinking deeper into the muck of ancestry. Oil lamps flicker around us, our shadows, dark glyphs on the wall, bigger and stranger than we are. Incident. We tell the story every year, how we peered from the windows, shades drawn, though nothing really happened, the charred grass now green again. We peered from the windows, shades drawn, at the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, the charred grass still green. Then we darkened our rooms, lit the hurricane lamps. At the cross, trussed like a Christmas tree, a few men gathered, white as angels in their gowns. We darkened our rooms and lit hurricane lamps, the wicks trembling in their fonts of oil. It seemed the angels had gathered, white men in their gowns. When they were done, they left quietly. No one came. The wicks trembled all night in their fonts of oil. By morning, the flames had all dimmed. When they were done, the men left quietly. No one came. Nothing really happened. By morning, all the flames had dimmed. We tell the story every year. I'm going to finish up now with two poems. This is Monument. Today, the ants are busy beside my front steps, weaving in and out of the hill they're building. I watch them emerge and, like everything I've forgotten, disappear into the subterranean, a world made by displacement. In the cemetery last June, I circled, lost, weeds and grass grown up all around, the landscape blurred and waving. At my mother's grave, ants streamed in and out like arteries, a tiny hill rising above her untended plot. Bit by bit, red dirt piled up, spread like a rash on the grass. I watched a long time the ants' determined work, how they brought up soil of which she will be part, and piled it before me. Believe me when I say I've tried not to begrudge them their industry, this reminder of what I haven't done. Even now, the mound is a blister on my heart, a red and humming swarm. This last poem has an epigraph from E.O. Wilson that reads, "Homo sapiens is the only species to suffer psychological exile." South. I returned to a stand of pines, bone-thin phalanx flanking the roadside, tangle of understory, a dialectic of dark and light, and magnolias blossoming like afterthought, each flower a surrender, white flags draped among the branches. I returned to Land's End, the swath of coast clear-cut and buried in sand, mangrove, live oak, gulfweed raised and replaced by thin palms, palmettos, symbols of victory or defiance, over and over, marking this vanquished land. I returned to a field of cotton, hallowed ground as slave legend goes, each bowl holding the ghosts of generations, those who measured their days by the heft of sacks and lengths of rows, whose sweat flecked the cotton plants still sewn into our clothes. I returned to a country battlefield where colored troops fought and died, Port Hudson, where their bodies swelled and blackened beneath the sun, unburied until Earth's green sheet pulled over them, unmarked by any headstones. Where the roads, buildings, and monuments are named to honor the Confederacy, where that old flag still hangs, I return to Mississippi, state that made a crime of me, mulatto, half-breed, native in my native land, this place, they'll bury me. Thank you.
I was just saying to Natasha that was so beautiful, I stopped being nervous listening to her. I'm Helen Shulman. I'm so glad to be here. I first came here in 1984 as a contributor. Thank you for having me back. I'm going to be reading from my new book, A Day at the Beach. I'm reading from the middle of it, so I actually had to write out what to tell you happened, so I don't leave anything out. But briefly, the book is about a marriage with a gun to its head. The gun being 9/11. It takes place on 9/11. It takes place in 24 hours, the whole book. And the couple in question are Gerhard and Susanna Fachttopf. He's a German-born choreographer in his 50s, and she was his principal dancer. She's 20 years younger, and his muse. That is until they had a little boy about 4 years ago named Nikolai, and since then she's been very preoccupied with this child, and with good reason. He's troubled. In the morning of September 11th, they live in Tribeca. They see the planes hit the towers. They watch people fall. They see the mayhem and the death. And Gerhard spirits them and their babysitter, Celine, out of this city. They're one of the last cars to get through the tunnels before the federal government closed down the bridges and the tunnels. And of all places, he drives them to East Hampton, to a mansion on the beach that belongs to his benefactor, Elspeth. And that's where we pick up. They're out in East Hampton, hence the title. Susanna's on the beach with Nikolai, stunned, looking at the ocean, wondering about everything that has just become of all of us. And Gerhard is at the store getting food, and Celine, the babysitter, is up at the mansion, up at the house. And they're watching a surfer. The surfer, who'd been paddling out farther and farther into the ocean, caught sight of a rising swell, turned and rapidly began to propel himself and his board toward shore. This wave was a doozy, Susanna noted, and even Nikolai looked up for a moment, the moment when Susanna called out, "Look at that," to watch the wall of water rise and the surfer race it first, and then just when the wave was about to overtake him, let it curl around him before taking it on himself. He hopped up onto the board, achieving a kind of balance even Susanna the ballerina could only dream of, and rode that sucker in. She couldn't help it, but the theme from Hawaii Five-0 escaped out between her lips, a campy Pavlovian response. "Cowabunga," Susanna whispered into Nikolai's hair. But he was working, Nikolai, he's digging, and he did not bother to acknowledge her. Then the wave began to crash. The board shot out from beneath the surfer as if he were slipping on a banana peel, sending him up into the air and then back first, arms and legs akimbo, down into the water where he was buried by foam and spray. 2 heart-stopping seconds later, and the guy surfaced again, at least his head did, and then his arms, one after the other, as he swam toward shore. All of a sudden, the surfer was up and running, the board beneath his arm, out of the surf, through the run up onto the sand, right toward her, like in a TV commercial, Susanna thought. He was running toward her like she was his long-lost lover. For an instant, Susanna felt like springing to her feet and running toward him, too, running right into his wet, slippery embrace. If she ran up to the surfer and he hugged her, could he pull her into an alternate universe, one where she was a surfer chick and he was her hippie lover, and Nikolai was their sun-toasted beach baby? Could she enter endless summer? The impulse was strong to rise to her feet, to test this cosmos' psychic membrane and the permeability of another, but she did not. Instead, Susanna stayed where she was, and the surfer's run slowed to a jog, and then a walk as he trudged up the beach to where Susanna and Nikolai were sitting. He walked more and more slowly, as if the ocean itself had propelled him up onto shore, and now, without its push, he was losing his momentum. At one point, he stopped to spit out, it seemed, seawater from where it had collected in his lungs. "Hey," said the surfer. He was about 20 feet away now, 20 feet and gaining. "Hello," said Susanna. "Is this your beach?" he said. As he came closer, she saw that he was a rather handsome young man in his mid to late 20s, with dark hair that clung to his head and wet ringlets, a little bit of silver gilding the curls. His jaw and nose were strong. He pointed up to Elspeth's manse. "Is that your house?" the surfer asked. "Yes and no," said Susanna. "I mean, we stay there, but it doesn't matter, you know. As far as I'm concerned, the beach belongs to everyone." She took a deep breath, especially today. The surfer stopped a few feet away and plugged his board into the sand. He stood where he stood and dripped. He looked at Nikolai. "Cute kid," said the surfer. "Thank you," said Susanna, her body instinctively closing in around Nikolai to protect him, to hide him. Like a little Venus flytrap, Nikolai pushing past her, roughly unfolding the enveloping petals of her legs and arms. Nothing could stop his digging. Susanna noticed that Nikolai was humming. Sometimes she noticed, and sometimes she didn't. The surfer watched him for a moment, an odd expression on his face. Then he looked up at Susanna. He smiled at her. "So you don't care that I was riding your waves?" He said this like he was picking up the thought that had been hanging in the air, awaiting resumption. And he said it kind of flirty, with a big, toothy grin that gave his handsomeness a boyish grace and made it less imposing. He had a broad, flat Long Island accent, which Susanna had always liked because it sounded masculine to her, like men who labored, who called their friends their brothers, who drank beer and worked hard and sometimes bent the law a little, like the Bronx brogue she'd heard all her life had always sounded. They were different, of course, the inflections, but she found both familiar and somehow comforting. "No, I don't care," said Susanna. The surfer leaned over and shook out his hair like a dog would shake out its coat, water spraying everywhere. He stood up again and grinned. "I forgot my towel," he said. Susanna instinctively reached back in the sand for one, but she hadn't stopped to bring out a towel either. "Me too," said Susanna. "What's your excuse?" said the surfer. His eyes were brown and his lashes, still wet, twinkled in the sun like the diamond-tipped kind you could buy at Duane Reade, the false ones, the kind Susanna and her girlfriends had bought together when she was a kid, the kind that one season during a performance of a reinterpretation of the Pas de Deux from Balanchine's Jewels, where Petipa meets Tchaikovsky as interpreted by Fachthoff, Susanna had worn as Diamond Queen. "My excuse," said Susanna. What was her excuse? "I guess I was too freaked out. I needed, she corrected herself, to see the ocean. Something big and unsullied that even now felt inalterable." The surfer looked at her in puzzlement, but the grin was still plastered to his face. He unzipped his wetsuit and started to peel down to his waist. There was dark curly hair on his chest, and his belly beneath the fleece was cut. The sun twinkled off the gem-like drops of water that clung to that hair. Had she ever made love to someone so young? She tried to remember. She wasn't sure. "It's a beautiful day, huh?" said the surfer. It was. "Yes," said Susanna, "beautiful." "I was on my way to work. I live in Port Jeff," he said, "when I saw that sunshine and the waves, and I thought, man, are you going to be a working stiff all your life? Are you going to take advantage of hurricane season, the warm water, the big clean waves?" Here the surfer's voice got a little far away, like he was drifting off to a dreamy place. "A day like today, that's what surfers live for," he said, this to Susanna, as if he were telling her a secret, his secret, the secret of his universe. Then he almost sounded a little pissed off. "I thought, what the hell, I'm going to play hooky. I always leave my board in my car, and I'd forgotten to unload my wetsuit over the weekend, so I hung a Yui." He motioned, steering his imaginary car into a steep curve. Then the surfer pointed up toward the bluff. "I'm parked over there. Inside you'll find a pinstripe suit and a pair of wingtips and a briefcase. A fucking BlackBerry. I can't believe it myself sometimes." He shook his head and then he laughed. It was a cleansing laugh, like a brief sunshiny rain, like it was preposterous that he could be old enough and accomplished enough to warrant the wingtips. A whole torrent of mixed and passionate emotions had just passed through this young man while he was talking to Susanna for reasons that were inexplicable to either one of them, and now that it was over, he didn't quite know what to do. "Well, I best be getting to the office now. I mean, how long can you be at the dentist?" The surfer shrugged his broad shoulders. "I don't know," said Susanna. "You don't know what?" said the surfer. "How long you can be at the dentist," said Susanna. "Right," said the surfer, looking even more puzzled than before. He picked up his board and started to walk away from her, the arms of his wetsuit swinging behind him like twin tails. There were dimples on the bottom 2 quadrants of his back above his butt. At the hips, he had the faintest hint of love handles, so nascent and he so arrogantly handsome, he was probably still in denial over them. He walked about 10 feet past Susanna and Nikolai, her eyes still watching him, before he turned around. "Why were you freaked out?" he said. "If you don't mind my asking. I mean, you and the kid, you're okay, right?" Again, that intense stare, the open portholes of his eyes. Susanna swiveled to look at him. "By the towers. I was freaked out by the towers," said Susanna. Now the guy looked really puzzled. Was it possible he didn't know? "How long have you been surfing?" Susanna asked. "I don't know," said the surfer. "Pretty much all morning." "What time is it?" As if to answer himself, he looked up at the sky, at the sun. "Is it 12:30, 1 o'clock?" "They fell at 10 o'clock," said Susanna. "The south tower, the other one fell at around 10:30. "What are you talking about?" said the surfer. His face was white beneath the tan. "The Twin Towers," said Susanna, "the World Trade Center." "Lady, are you crazy?" said the surfer. "Did you talk to Donna? Did she put you up to this?" He looked around as if Donna were hiding somewhere on the open sand. "2 airplanes flew into the Twin Towers," said Susanna. She said it slowly as she would tell it to a child, simply and without much emotion. "They caught fire and they fell down." "The airplanes caught on fire?" Susanna looked at the surfer's face. It expressed what was going on inside him, which was that he was caught between knowing and not knowing. His face was sorting out his reality, and shock was winning. Frightened, he wasn't nearly as handsome. His teeth were bared and fangy. Terror releases the animal in some of us, Susanna supposed, as if she were somewhere else watching a movie maybe, somewhere where she was meant to be observing something. She supposed that if she was standing closer to the surfer, that she could smell the sourness of his fear. Susanna got to her feet. She edged up the beach sideways, a little bit away from Nikolai toward the surfer, her head turning from left to right, not knowing which boy to focus on, worried that all this scary stuff might upset her son, but Nikolai wasn't paying attention. Nikolai was digging. He was humming and digging, hum, hum, hum. Susanna walked closer to the surfer. He looked very angry. He looked angry with her. It was a little alarming how angry he looked, so she stopped approaching him. 2 airplanes flew into the Twin Towers on purpose, said Susanna. Both buildings caught fire and then they fell down. She kind of hissed this at him in a whisper, and she instantly felt bad about it. She wasn't handling any of this very well, she thought. She tried to soften her stance. "They fell down," she said quietly. "The Twin Towers, they fell down?" said the surfer. His surfboard dropped to the ground. After a brief, awkward moment, as if someone had pressed the pause button, he started hopping around. "Are you shitting me? The Twin Towers fell down?" It was like his feet were dancing on hot coals. Reflexively, Susanna reached out a hand to grab his arm to soothe him. "It's okay," said Susanna, when of course it wasn't. Just then Nikolai began to scream. At the sound of his scream, Susanna's hand tightened on the surfer's arm. She whipped about, pulling the surfer off his feet, making him lose his balance. He crashed into her, which hurt. He was heavy, a big man, and she stumbled and fell. Her palm scraped the sand. Nikolai was only about 15 feet behind her. There was nothing in between them, but it was as if he couldn't see her, as if he was blind. Nikolai was churning wildly around in circles. His screams were ear-splitting. He reminded Susanna of something she couldn't quite identify. He reminded her of one of those pinwheels that shoots sparks as its wings whirl around and around, or the rotating light on top of the ambulance. Something else, what was it? Something else that incorporated the flinging out of energy, spinning plus sound. "Nikolai, I'm here. Mommy's here." Susanna pushed herself up to her feet and began to run toward him, that low center of gravity jog that is running through sand. It took her forever, it seemed, to go across such a small segment of beach. She was wiping her stinging hands on her jeans, calling out to him as she went, "Nikolai." Already Susanna had begun castigating herself, but even her own super protective barometer was a little shocked by the severity of his response. She really wasn't that far away from him. She just left Nikolai's immediate circle, his personal space, that's all. "Nikolai." As Susanna approached, she saw that his face was practically purple from screaming and that it was slick with tears and mucus. In half a second, he'd gone from A to Z, from zoned out and humming to complete and total hysteria. Susanna's little boy stood in one place screaming and screaming like he was a siren himself, a siren on the beach, alerting the boats, the swimmers, the fish even, all the sea and sand creatures to a clear and present danger. His screams were so loud that Susanna wondered, are his fingers being crushed by a closed car door? Which was patently ridiculous because she could see him right before her freaking out in the sand, But she thought the thought just the same because that's what his cries sounded like. Barry, her eldest brother, had shut a car door on her hand when she was a child, and that was what her own voice had sounded like in her own ears, so shrill and yet emanating from somewhere far, far outside of her. Is this what the people inside the towers sounded like as the flames climbed up and the floors came down? In just 10 steps, in about 5 seconds, Susanna was brought back to Nikolai's side. The time itself stretched thinner and longer by her own growing sense of alarm, her arms around him, crushing his body to her, her hands discovering his shoulders, compressing down on his joints, finding his hips and applying pressure. Nikolai was stiff and non-compliant with fear or anger or whatever it was that made him shout so, and Susanna kept working on him, trying to quiet him down. Sweetie pie, darling, Mama's here, Mama's here. She wrestled him to the ground. In a body lock, she stroked his little back. Under the t-shirt, there was golden fur. She'd once furtively licked it lightly, twice, maybe 3 times while he slept. I'm right here, Nikolai. And she was right there, but the surfer was gone. It wasn't long after that Susanna heard Celine yelling. That's the babysitter. It took a long while for her to recognize the sound, its presence, and its origins because of Nikolai and his howling. Celine, a treble note to his soprano, the caterwauling at once oddly orchestrated and symphonic. By the time Susanna got herself and Nikolai back up the sandy bluff to the cottage and entered the yellow and white tiled kitchen, she'd carried him and she'd dragged him. She'd cajoled him and she'd admonished him. Finally, she'd slung him over her shoulder and trying her best to balance him. He went rigid when he got like that. He was like a board, so he kept sliding across her collarbones, which irritated the skin there, the rubbing of his shirt against her bra strap. She had a little raised mole near her shoulder, and now it felt like it was bleeding. Celine wasn't screaming anymore. She was huddled in the corner of the room, sitting on the Florentine hand-painted tiles, canary yellow, with little purple grapes or plums clustered at their middles, maybe they were olives, staring stupidly at the surfer. He was leaning over the center island, shouting into the telephone, bellowing really, I'm not dead, I'm not dead. Donna, I'm not dead, Donna, I'm not dead, Donna, Donna, Donna. He paused to take a breath, and then he erupted. I was surfing, for fuck's sake, I was surfing. He started to laugh. He laughed and laughed and laughed, and then all of a sudden he was weeping. He was weeping so violently, he was howling, and even Nikolai stopped screaming, staring at the crying surfer with curiosity. Are you all right, Susanna said to Celine, who nodded yes, yes, dumbly from her seat in the corner of the kitchen, a few tears leaking out her eyes. Susanna wiped the sweat from her brow, her upper lip that felt dirty. She felt like she was smearing a dirt mustache across her face. It had been hard work lugging Nikolai. She could smell her own armpits. Between her legs, she could smell herself. The surfer was leaning on the center island now, sobbing, open mouth, drool dangling from his bottom lip, one hand practically wrenching the curls from his head, the phone sagging limply from the other. His position was almost comical, except it wasn't. A voice kept escaping out of the holes of the receiver. It sounded frantic. Gently, Susanna wrested the phone from the surfer's hand. She spoke into the mouthpiece. Hello, she said, hello. Oh my God, he's all right, Danny's all right. A woman wept into the phone. I thought he was dead, she said. He's not dead, said Susanna. He was playing hooky. He skipped work and he went surfing. His office is on the 102nd floor of the South Tower, the woman whispered into the phone, her Long Island accent, a female bookend to the surfers. She whispered it, Susanna supposed, so the devil wouldn't hear. For a split second, Susanna wondered, was the surfer this Danny? Was he the man she'd watched take that high dive out of the burning tower? The one with the tide floating gracefully behind him? Had he miraculously landed safely? hopped into his car and driven out to the beach just like her? Was he just like her, an escape artist running away from true mayhem to counterfeit perfection, leaving insanity behind? The thought was ridiculous, ludicrous. Susanna worried that she was going crazy. She literally shook it out of her head, a rapid nose side-to-side motion, the madness exiting out her ears. The man she saw, her man, he was dead. Unknowable and untouchable, he had to be. Wow, said Susanna, shaking her head. The South Tower, you are so lucky. Sandler O'Neill, Donna said on the other end. Do you think they're all gone? She said this confidingly, with hope in her delivery, like they were intimates, like they were girlfriends. Do you think any of them could have made it out? I don't know, sweetie, said Susanna, a girlfriend right back at her. Was it possible? Surely some of those Sandler O'Neill guys must have had the foresight to clear out when the first tower was hit. Although on NPR they said that there had been an announcement over the South Tower PA system telling evacuated workers that it was now safe to return to their office just 2 minutes before the very same building was attacked. Still, there must have been renegades, no? Susanna thought with hope, people who thought for themselves. She was afraid she would not have been one of them. After the second plane crashed, was it possible for someone on the 102nd floor to make it down the stairs to safety? Were the staircases open? Were there survivors ready to be rescued from the rubble? Anything was possible. After an earthquake in Turkey or some Latin American country, there were always survivors waiting to be dug out. She should donate blood. As soon as she went home, Susanna would volunteer at a local hospital. She would go to nursing school, get her MD. Ideas, they flew in and out through her mind like so many swooping birds. In her head, she heard a voice instructing her, "You must change your life." Whose voice was it? She wondered. Was it his? Nina? Do you think Nina could have survived? Asked the woman on the phone. I really hope so, said Susanna. She wanted this Nina alive. Oh, God, Donna whispered. She whispered it like a prayer. Please, God, just Nina. I would be satisfied with Nina, she said. 10 minutes before, Donna probably had been making the same plea to God about her Danny. Wasn't that the way it is with people, thought Susanna? As soon as we get what we ask for something more. She'd been the same way about Nikolai. Please, God, just a child, any child. Then when he was born, please, God, just let this child be all right. The surfer was pulling himself together now. He was taking great, big, deep, cleansing breaths. He looked like he was in labor, Susanna thought, hunched over like that and panting. He reached for the phone. Susanna passed it to him. Donna, said the surfer, baby, I'm coming home. Tears came to Susanna's eyes, looking at this great, big, good-looking, shaking man going home to his baby. She reached out and pulled Nikolai close to her. Her fingers ruffled his hair. He was quiet now, thank God. On the beach, a half hour or so before, Susanna had yearned to belong to a different life, to open another book and walk into its pages. This time, she wished simply that she were Donna. Donna of the fervent and trusting whispers, Donna who was lucky enough that she still believed she could barter with God. If Susanna were Donna, then later today, it would be Susanna whose breath would stop and whose heart would leap. It would be Susanna who was destined to be flooded with joy when Danny walked through her front door. Susanna could almost feel the blessed mixture of relief and elation in her body, the weightlessness in her bones when he came home to her, when she saw him, big and strong, his great broad shoulders taking up the entire width of the doorframe, filling the space, Joy's white-hot light emanating out from the top of her head, making the world glow, the survivor's high. It wasn't hers to claim. Susanna, she hadn't survived anything. Thank you.